November is National Family Caregivers Month, and my next guest's personal experience will certainly speak to the many of you who are either caring for or did care for loved ones who are ill. She is the Director of Communications at EWTN, the author of a very personal new book, Walking the Way of the Cross for Caregivers, How to Cope Practically, Emotionally, and Spiritually when a loved one has a serious illness. Here to share with us her inspiring story is Michelle Laque Johnson. Michelle, thanks for being here. As anyone who has done it certainly knows, caring for a loved one who's seriously ill can be an enormous challenge. I want to start with your own story. Tell us about your late husband, Stu, and what you both endured for 8 years.
Well, my husband was an amazing man, and I was about to find out just how amazing. He had 3 bouts of cancer over 8 years, had his leg amputated up to the hip, and he became a quadriplegic. And during that time, I was working here at EWTN, thank God, because there was a very good healthcare program, and they did allow me to work from home when needed. But it was a time that was very difficult and yet very blessed. And one of the things that I really emphasize to people when I talk about this is, you know, you think sometimes in the beginning that it's just going to be all something terrible. There were so many beautiful memories that we created over those 8 years. We got so much closer to each other as we worked together to save his life. And his cancer was misdiagnosed for a year. So if that hadn't happened, you know, he'd probably still be here. But they told us he had very little chance of living more than a few months. And instead, he lived 8 years.
You titled the book Walking the Way of the Cross for Caregivers. Why did you decide to arrange it that way and frame really what is also a spiritual and emotional advice book? Why did you decide to frame it in the form of the Stations of the Cross?
Well, Raymond, I was actually in church about 7 years after my husband's death, and I had been kind of just messing around, you know, writing different parts of the book and not really knowing how I was going to do this. And we were saying the Stations of the Cross, and all of a sudden, the things that had happened over those 8 years just started flashing through my mind. And I was just given to know that we really were walking the way of the cross. And I think it's a beautiful thing because, you know, I didn't think of it that way when it was happening, but if you do, and I share that with people, it gives your suffering cosmic meaning. It just, it makes everything, because you're following Jesus's way.
Michelle, you had 2 specific audiences in mind when you wrote this book. This is from the preface. 2 kinds of people are likely to pick up this book. The first, and hopefully the largest group, will be those of you whose loved ones are ill and who are seeking advice, reassurance, and a companion to accompany you on the journey to which you've been called. Some of you may have picked up the book because you're wondering, how could there be any blessings in terminal illness, and whether pulling the plug, either literally or figuratively, isn't a better option. Michelle, talk to me about those 2 audiences and the case of Brittany Maynard, which you address in the book.
I do, Raymond, and she became the face of the Right to Die movement a number of years ago. For people who don't remember, she was, you know, diagnosed with what the doctor said was a terminal illness, and she didn't want to have to go through what she saw as a great deal of suffering. So her family took her to Oregon, where she did commit suicide. And I'm not telling that story to be judgmental about her, but I'm telling the story because I want people who read this book to see what I believe death with dignity really looks like. And it's not killing yourself, because we're going to go through the cross either way. When the person dies, that's another cross. And if you do it prematurely, you are going to miss so much. You're going to miss the opportunity to find out what selfless love really is. And I can tell you, you will have conversations with your loved one that you never would have had. You will have chances to go places and do things that'll be memories for a lifetime. And you will grow in virtue. It was a battle the two of us were fighting together, and it drew us closer to each other because, we came to depend on each other in different ways. And I got a chance to see, my husband was the bravest man I've ever seen. And there was so many instances where I got to see that. When he had his leg amputated, I've never seen more bravery in my life. We had to wait the entire day. We were sitting there. He couldn't eat, couldn't drink. They brought him in at the end of the day. And I watched him. We prayed together, and as they came in to wheel him out, he put his hands on either side of the gurney and just gave that nod like he was going into battle. And it's a memory. I mean, yes, it's a hard memory, but it's also a memory of a man who wanted to be here for me. And it's a memory of love.
In the book, you consider caretaking a calling. You write, whether he or she leaves earthly life or lives to fight another day, this experience will change both of you. If you understand your purpose here, it is more likely to make you better rather than bitter. Speak to me about the enormity of that role. Explain how caregivers can better understand what their really, not only their role, their responsibility is in that moment. And about the memories, you all made a determined effort to make new memories, even with the prospect of death looming.
Yes, we did, Raymond. And I mean, what you just brought up is incredibly important, because if you understand your purpose, the Lord, the God the Father, sent his Son down to suffer and die for us. So I thought about that a lot, because otherwise, I mean, what's the purpose of all this? Jesus's purpose of coming down here was to save us, from our sins. What is our purpose in suffering? Because there is a purpose, and Jesus is the model.
As I read the book, it really does awaken you and sensitize you to not only the reason for our journey here, but the reason we go on this journey together, particularly when you're talking about spouses or parents, and the deep spiritual and life and eternal truths that can be gleaned from even these painful moments. So oftentimes, the healings we get are not the healings we expect. And that was sort of my big takeaway as I read your book. As I mentioned earlier, Michelle, November is National Caregivers Month. With the aging of the population, and very likely many more caregivers at home at this point in their lives, what's the most important message you want readers to take away from walking the way of the cross for caregivers?
Well, there's several messages that are important, and one is that the good times are not over, okay? And I have a whole chapter in there about how we went to a dude ranch in Wyoming when he only had less than a year to live, and, there's good times. But the most important thing that people have to do is make the decision, number one, that they're in this for the long haul, and that they're going to walk with Jesus along the way of the cross in order to do this. People will sometimes say, well, I couldn't have done what you did. And I want to say to them, well, I couldn't have done it either if I hadn't turned to God. Because anything I did that was good was a result of the grace that he gave me. I give examples in the book. For example, in the very beginning, I was standing outside of the room where my husband was laying, and I had to, he was waiting for me to wrap his leg because it was filled with cancer. And I didn't humanly want to go in there and do this, and I tell this story. But even if you turn just slightly to the Lord, which I did internally, and I was given this prayer, which is not the way I normally pray, and it was, Divine Physician, help me. And at that moment, I got the grace. And I walked in and I said, come on, honey, let's do this. And he was like, I'm so sorry I have to put you through this. And I said, it's not a problem. And it wasn't, because I got the grace. And so that's why we cannot take this into our hands. It's important that as a couple or as a family, whatever you're working together, and you know you're not doing it of yourselves. Because most of us, I would say all of us, could not do it if we didn't have Jesus by our side. And I so mean that.
Michelle, thank you for being here. Walking the Way of the Cross for Caregivers by Michelle Laque Johnson is available in bookstores everywhere and online, including EWTN's catalog. For more information and resources, visit caregiversofthecross.com. Thank you, Michelle.
Thank you, Raymond.